we just have to keep doing it. We need more organizations. Those organizations need more visibility. Uh, the LGBT movement has to examine its own ageism. And those of us who are, you know, getting up there need to claim it. You know, me, I go around saying, I don't like being 74. Well, I don't have to like it, but I need to make it visible.
Welcome to the Zami Nobla National Organization of Black Lesbians on Aging podcast. We are your sound source for Black lesbian herstory. I'm your host, Angela Denise Davis. Today, our guest is Dr. Cheryl Clark. She really needs no introduction, for she is a fierce Black lesbian poet who's been doing this work for a very long time. What a pleasure and honor it's been for her to spend some time with us talking about poetry, women in leadership, the legacy of revolution, and just the joys of being alive to tell about it. Without further ado, Dr. Clark.
I'm Cheryl Clark. How do I show up in the world? Well, I hope I show up as a lesbian. I've been doing it since 1973. I also show up as a poet and a writer, a sister, meaning I have two sisters younger than me. And I think that's enough for now, Angela.
Okay. We'll get into some more, certainly, as we engage this wonderful conversation. And Dr. Clark, is just such an honor to have you here on the Zami Nobla podcast as we archive Black lesbian herstory. And you have some very interesting herstory that we are so glad to be able to share with our listening audience. Tell us a little bit about your formative years and where you grew up.
I grew up in Washington, D.C. I was born in 1947. My parents worked for the government. My mother for the city government, my father for the federal government. We went to Catholic schools until 12th grade. I guess I would have to say that did have quite an impact on me, Catholic school education, especially when I went to high school. I went to an all-girls high school. So I thought it was very good that we had teachers who cared about our minds. And I learned to care about my mind too. We always loved reading. My mother was an avid reader. She was also a crossword puzzle whiz. She really was. She worked a crossword puzzle every day, and she finished it. So we had those kinds of examples. My father was a little bit more reserved than my mother, and he was a good cook. They were both good cooks, and very protective. So we were very sheltered. And then when I graduated from high school, I went to Howard, 1965, 1969. I had a great time there, especially as I attended during the Black Power, Black Arts movement. So it was a very politically charged atmosphere at Howard. I majored in English and just had a good time. It was quite formative because uh, I learned about African American culture and history and literature, which enabled me to continue my study beyond undergraduate years. Did my graduate work at Rutgers in New Jersey, where I lived for 41 years, worked at Rutgers for 41 years. I retired in 2013. Boy, I've really jumped up there. I went from being a child in Washington, D.C. to retirement.
Well, there's so many wonderful, incredible things within the landscape of your life. I'm curious, was there anything in your childhood that was a seedling to your becoming a poet?
Uh, yes, my Catholic school education, because the teachers emphasized writing, and sometimes they emphasized creative writing.
Mm.
And they emphasized literature. So that education motivated me to pursue poetry. And I started to write poetry more seriously in college, then in graduate school. So also, as I said, the Black Arts, Black Power movement basically occurred on the Howard campus. So poetry was a big deal among uh, activists and political people. And so during that time, if I may be so bold as to say this, we see the emergence of women writers as a force with which to be reckoned. So, you would have people like Sonia Sanchez, of course, Nikki Giovanni, Carolyn Rogers, and a number of other women writers, which I think gave birth to the novelists we see coming to us in the late 60s, I'll say 69 into the 70s, like Toni Cade, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison. So, yes, um, it was my Catholic school education.
I'm curious to know what the landscape was like then for Black lesbian women who were writing and emerging alongside the Black Power movement and also trying to find ground and space as women finding their own voice and speaking in their own space as Black women, as Black lesbians. What was that like then, and the emergence of women being able to go from there into what we see in the 1980s with just this wellspring, certainly, of Black lesbian feminist voices?
as far as I know, if there was a landscape for Black lesbian writers during the Black arts movement, it must have been hidden because the Black arts movement and the Black power movement was a homophobic movement and a sexist movement.
Mm-hmm.
Pronounced sexism. Um, we don't see Black lesbian writers until we see Audre Lorde, and we don't know right away that she's a lesbian. I guess one of her most important early publications was From a Land Where Other People Live, which was published in 1973 by Broadside Press, which was a major arbiter of the Black arts movement and Black arts poetry. Actually, we were just talking about that on that documentary series Pride that Cheryl Dunye just did. There's the segment on the 70s, and we talk about how Dudley Randall asked Audre Lorde to exclude her poem, Love Poem, from that collection because it spoke to love between women. So even the little bit of landscape that we might have had was hidden. Well, we knew about James Baldwin. Of course, Baldwin never saw himself as he didn't mind seeing himself as a homosexual. He would never have used the word gay, but he suffered a lot too. You know, remember Eldridge Cleaver's disparagement of Baldwin in Soul on Ice. So the landscape was hidden. We don't begin to see a landscape until maybe around 1979 with the publication of Audre Lorde's A Black Unicorn. Also, Barbara Smith's 1977 article toward a Black feminist criticism, where she analyzes Morrison's Sula as a lesbian novel. Of course, a lot of Black people didn't like that because, they loved Sula and they loved The Bluest Eye. They loved Sula, but they did not want to see a lesbian analysis of the relationship between Nell and Sula. So we don't begin to see a landscape until the late 70s, I'm afraid. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am.
It is interesting because as we look at what happened in the 70s and that now being able to look back and get some inkling of a glimpse of light, certainly not enough light on the landscape, but I think of someone like Lorraine Hansberry, who only now looking back, we get just a sense of her, but she was certainly alone and not in the sisterhood, certainly that we see in the period of which you just spoke. And now I think because the times have changed, sometimes we forget just how much courage and bravado it took for these women like Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith, and yourself to write and to speak and to give voice and visibility to the lives of Black lesbians. So it seems that just the whole weight of that period, I think now is lost to so many of us because we can speak and we have a measure of visibility now that certainly then was very risky to go out and to do.
Yes, it becomes much less risky in the 70s because we begin to see gay and lesbian community, especially if you live near Manhattan, as I did, though I lived in New Jersey. And what was part of a lesbian community, a Black lesbian community, and one benefited from the social atmosphere, especially in a place like New York. So whereas the lesbian and gay community came together at house parties, there were some bars, but they weren't always that great. Especially the women's bars in New York City were awful. We thought they were great, but they were really tacky. If you went somewhere like San Francisco and saw the bars there, or Atlanta or Chicago, and then you come back to Manhattan and you have this little tacky bar. I mean bar.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, I used to go to this bar, Bonnie and Clyde. It was a famous New York City lesbian bar. And it was so tacky, but I loved it. We loved it. We used to die to go there. And I didn't realize how tacky it was until I took a friend of mine, a straight friend, into the bar. And she said, Cheryl, this place is really tacky. I said, oh, is it? But we weren't going there to deal with the tacky bar. We were going there to be with the women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was the main thing.
And now it's kind of sad because we don't have those lesbian bars anymore and clubs.
No, we don't. I say bring them back.
We don't have that sort of socialization, and so
we don't.
One of the things that we do with Zami Nobla is try to provide some of those social outlets so that women can come together, and we do it online a lot now, not just because of COVID, but just because it's been one way we've been able to do it. But you miss, well, I guess you can't miss what you never had, certainly in my regard, but for women who have had the joy of those lesbian spaces and not having that anymore, it seems like there's a real loss.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. But we have many more outlets now for community.
Yes.
And we don't have to be in the closet as much. I'm not going to say the closet. Or, having to be careful is not over.
Yeah.
I mean, we still have to do that, but
Well,
you
that's
know,
interesting because we do have a restaurant here, Twisted Soul, and
what's it called?
it's called Twisted Soul Cookhouse and Pours, and Chef Deborah Van Treese is the chef there, and she and her wife Lorraine Lane really have provided a landmark restaurant here in Atlanta. So we have places like that. We have Black lesbians who are doing things like that, who are having places, and so although it's not strictly lesbian, it's nice to go to some places where you know you are welcome, you're at home, and it's fine. So I think that's a part of what we see now with people being able to be out is, you know, you can be a chef and a restaurateur, and
Uh-huh.
you can create these social spaces for us to enjoy. And it's a very different, I imagine, very different space. And I would imagine, and you can tell me what you think about this, just the opportunity for people to be out more has really changed the ways in which people may have had a concentrated way of being together. Now, since you can go any place, you may not necessarily go to the places that are quote unquote specifically lesbian. I think the same thing may be true in terms of integration, you know, because Black people can go to any restaurant.
Yeah,
Sometimes the things that are specifically ours, we don't support as much.
that's true.
You marked 1973 as a very pivotal year when you gave your introduction. What happened in 1973?
Well, 1973 was the year that I decided I wanted to be a lesbian. I say came out, just to make a long story short, but I spent maybe 6 months in the closet, deciding this is what I wanted to do. But 1973 was the year I claimed lesbianism and started to live as a lesbian and to join a lesbian community. Specifically, well, I lived in New Brunswick, New Jersey, which was about almost an hour from Manhattan. More than that from Brooklyn. God knows you have to go so far to get to Brooklyn still. So I was part of a lesbian community in New Brunswick because we had the university there. And there were a lot of lesbians at the university. And Rutgers had one of the first gay student organizations in the country. Interestingly enough, founded by a gay Black man
Mm.
who died of AIDS in 1985 in San Francisco. Uh, so that's what I mean for myself personally, having spent very little time in the closet. And then, I hung out with members of a Black lesbian organization called Salsa Soul Sisters. They still exist, but they have another name now, which, what are they called? Ancestral African Lesbians of the East Coast, XYZ,
Okay.
something like that. Ancestral African Lesbian. But in the 70s and 80s, they were Salsa Soul Sisters. And they were always hanging tough in that bar, Bonnie and Clyde. And that was what I did in 1973 and throughout the 70s. And it wasn't until the late, I'll say 1979, that I took writing as a lesbian seriously. When I first published in Conditions 5, the Black women's issue, which was edited by Barbara Smith and Lorraine Bethel. That was 1979. And then, it became an imperative to continue to write as a lesbian, because, as I've said many times, I'm sure people are sick of hearing me say this, but I'll say it again anyway. Um, the gay and lesbian movement took a lot from the Black Power movement, especially in terms of the projection and promotion of culture as a liberating force for people. We had what we called gay pride. Well, gay pride didn't just come out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
It came from what the Black Power movement asked Black people to do, Black pride. Then, the culture, the literature, the theater, the poetry, especially for lesbians, the readings. Those were extremely important during the late 70s and 80s. The promotion of one's literary publications, the invention of new publications.
I think the same can be said of how the civil rights movement affected the disability rights movement. I know, especially in terms of the blind community, there was this saying, it wasn't, get whitey, it was get sighty. It really was about seeing what had happened and the power of the civil rights movement and people saying, well, I have a right to be who I am and to be treated equally.
Right.
And the women's rights movement, all of these things really have come in from the door opening experiences of the civil rights movement. And thinking about that and thinking about the Black arts movement and the women who were writing and the poets and writers of that era, I am curious to get your take on how women and the importance of their leadership in that very sexist and homophobic time really emerged, the emergence of women who are writing and poetry and the difference that made then.
I guess if we're talking about the emergence of a new kind of Black liberation struggle, which came about in the late 50s. I think if we remember, yes, there was James Meredith integrating Ole Miss. But if you think about the Little Rock Nine, you think about the girls who were involved. If we think about the University of Alabama, and I think we have Charlene Hunter Galt. So we see women involved in these struggles. And, women didn't want to take a back seat because we were needed. We were needed as strategists, tacticians. If you think about somebody like Ella Baker, who wasn't an out front person necessarily, Uh, or you think about somebody like Daisy Bates, whatever one might think of her, with the Little Rock Nine. She wanted to be out front. Uh, she wanted to be out front. Um, or we think about the SNCC women. So we had examples, as I was saying, Ella Baker.
Mm-hmm.
We had examples of women's leadership. If you think about um, Gloria Richardson from Cambridge, Maryland, who didn't take low to anybody. And there were so many women involved in the local grassroots. I'm saying grassroots because they were, the local NAACPs involved in the church. So as I'm sitting here talking, I'm saying to myself, women were always involved.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but they were able to garner more attention during, late 50s and so on and so forth, I think with television. So you saw more people involved,
Mm-hmm.
In movements.
I think of Stacey Abrams here in
Oh yeah.
Georgia,
Uh-huh.
who is just a phenomenal leader and has done some incredible work here. And certainly our Vice President, Kamala Harris, and just this real, this wealth of women leaders and what we've seen today. And they've not, emerged by themselves. Like you said, there is a legacy and there is a history of women in leadership. And sometimes I think we just forget how deep that legacy really is because we don't know all of the stories. We don't hear all the stories. And I think it's important for us to be able to talk more about them, to talk about the women who inspired us to do the work that we're called to do, which is why it's so important that we have you here on the podcast today to talk about your work because it has been foundational. I know your book, Living as a Lesbian, was reissued in 2013, and I think that may be the right date. I hope so.
2014.
2014, but it was first published in 1986. So it's this real classic that has withstood the test of time and proven to be part of that legacy of Black lesbians being able to point to a landmark. Certainly, you've written a number of other books as well, but I say that this particular book because I know that its publication by Firebrand Press, and
Firebrand Books.
Firebrand Books, yes, and they produce also a number of other incredible works. But just the legacy of women in leadership, women writers, women poets, it makes it so much more possible for us to do the work that we need today because we're standing on that legacy. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know your thoughts because you, as you said, were at Rutgers as an administrator for over 40 years. And with that legacy of being in the academy, and we see now what's going on with critical race theory and this real pushback that is happening. What are your thoughts on what's going on in the academy now, particularly around the ways in which issues of race, gender, and sexual orientation are being challenged?
Well, this is a long history in the academy, especially especially the predominantly white academy. And we have had to fight so hard to penetrate it, especially, you know, the public colleges and universities like Rutgers, because people were beginning to say, I mean, citizens, Black citizens of the state were beginning to say, look, I'm paying my taxes and my child can't even go to your school. And so we have Black students, Black and Latino students. At Rutgers, it was mainly African American and Puerto Rican students who made demands on the institution about the recruitment of more Black and Latino students. I guess I need to be saying Latinx students. Um, and demands for support programs for Black students, many of whom were not as well prepared for college as white students. So what I'm trying to say is that this is a lifelong struggle with predominantly white institutions. We are always struggling to maintain a presence and a prominence in these places. So it may not surprise us that a racist institution like the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where Nicole Hannah-Jones attended and she still claims she loves, would question or would torpedo her tenure, her, receipt of tenure as she's being hired. They don't want to give her tenure. She got to wait another 5 years or whatever. I don't know where it stands now, but it was this guy who gave the school $25 million who protested it. Well, that right there ought to show us. But, it's like, it's always a struggle in these historically racist institutions. And some of them have come along a lot further, let's say, than the University of North Carolina. Of course, the 1619 Project made a whole lot of people mad. Because she said, let's start it here. Let's start it at 1619. Somebody said, oh, it doesn't start at 1492. No, but she's saying, let's start. Some of it started in 1492. But, she said, let's start it here. Let's start American U.S. history here when you brought them slaves over, and forced them into servitude. And then forced the whole of West Africa into servitude. It's really amazing when you think about it. Because they say, I have heard some people say that even 500 million people is conservative, in
Right.
terms of slavery.
And that's a history we just don't want to deal with. We don't want to be honest with. We just celebrated Juneteenth this past weekend, and even celebration around that has been disturbing to so many people because we don't really want to handle the truth.
So many people don't want to know that truth, um, because they would have to admit their own culpability. They would have to admit the extent to which they have benefited. We have benefited from slavery of Africans. It's an amazing piece of history.
Well, and at some level, it seems like we are doomed to continually fight and to mobilize because these issues aren't new. And what we're seeing at UNC and other places around the country, just as you said, are long struggles that
Uh-huh.
have been there, and it's not new. It's not a new thing. It's a
No.
continuation of people trying to give voice to the truth and mobilize
Right.
for this work that's so important.
I know. Where did you go? Did you go and
I went to Clark Atlanta University.
oh, you did.
I
Oh, so you
did.
went to
I
HBCU too.
did. And
Oh, that's
but
good.
I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, so I was very much aware of the fact that I needed to go someplace where my mind was loved. And
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
and I
right.
received support because that was not the way in which I grew up in Kansas and in white schools being, the only kid in the gifted program. So like they couldn't find other black gifted students. So I know the importance of our schools and the importance of our organizations. And I guess my question to you as we come near an end to this interview is how do we continue to fight? How do we continue to mobilize, especially on behalf of the issues and concerns of older black lesbians? How do we keep moving on?
Um, well, we just move. Uh, long time ago in the late 70s, I worked for an agency that did outreach to well, we didn't call us senior citizens. We called us senior adults. Of course, I wasn't one then, obviously, but senior adults, But this is a relatively new identity for us as older lesbians. So we have to have our organizations. We have to continue with the visibility. Um, I think I'll always call myself a lesbian, though I can take on some of those other, um, some of those other names like queer, which I don't mind queer, but we just have to keep doing it. We need more organizations. Those organizations need more visibility. Uh, the LGBT movement has to examine its own ageism. And those of us who are, you know, getting up there need to claim it. Me, I go around saying, I don't like being 74. Well, I don't have to like it, but I need to make it visible. I mean, does anybody like getting old? I mean, we like getting mature. We think we are gaining wisdom. Some of us are just as dumb as we always have been. But we have to claim it more.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're doing this program. God, I can't believe you've been doing it for 3 years. This has to continue. Maybe we need a conference. I don't know. Maybe we need a Zammy Nobler conference. Maybe, I'm sure you've already had one, haven't you?
We've been able to do things along the way, but I think you're right. I think it's time for another gathering. And wouldn't it be great to have someone like you there with us?
I'd love to come.
Yes.
Atlanta.
I
It
think
would be a good place.
it would be a wonderful place. And I think that's what it is. I think we need opportunities to stop and say, we would love to gather, and we have some incredible sisters who are doing some incredible work, who have a legacy, and we need to share that, because there are so many younger women who may not know your work, who may not know the great legacy that you bear, and they need to know, because I think that's how we make that connection, so things continue to grow and we continue to mobilize and we have visibility as lesbians. Because one thing we don't have and we need more of is, certainly with older Black lesbians, is visibility, for people to see us and for us to see each other. Our time is short, and I would like for you to read a poem for us, if you would. But before you do that, I want to ask you this question. We are here in this very liminal space with the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's been a very different time. For so many of us, it's been also a very difficult time. What has your life been like over the past few months?
I have to say that I am very lucky, because my partner and I retired to the Catskills in 2013 in New York, upstate New York, toward the western part of the state. So I have felt very lucky, because there's only 400 people in our town.
Wow.
And I didn't run in. I mean, we did all of what we were supposed to do, the masks and all the other hygiene, but I hadn't seen my sister. She visited last week. I hadn't seen her in a year.
Wow.
In person.
Mm-hmm.
But we saw each other every week on Zoom,
Mm-hmm.
which, as far as I'm concerned, people talk about being tired of Zoom. I'm not tired of it. I love it.
It's pretty interesting technology, because if we
It
didn't have
is,
it, I
isn't
wouldn't
it?
be able to talk to you today if we didn't have it.
I know. And I think it's wonderful. So I consider myself very lucky to have been up here, and my partner owns a bookstore up here. Our town is a book village, so there's 6 independent bookstores in this town. You have to come and visit, and
Would love to.
so that's what it's been like for me. Very lucky,
Mm.
and we got our last inoculation at the end of March. I mean, it was hard to get them. Was it hard for you to get yours?
It was. And I was in Kansas with my mom, but COVID was and is, because we're not out of the woods yet, so to speak.
No. No, we aren't.
It's difficult, but so many people just are not taking it as seriously as I think that they should. Would you be kind enough to read something for our listening audience? We'd be deeply honored.
On their way to life. One, Sandra Bland, a fly black girl, brown skin and open brown face, anything but bland. Even in that mugshot, an orange jumpsuit on your way to life by way of Prairie View, Texas. Now joining the long list of infamous sites where unarmed Black death thrives in cop custody. If you're changing lanes and smoking a cigarette at the same time. But check it out, a fly black girl smoking a cigarette, brown skin, open brown face, even when pissed. After telling you to dump your smoke, brags, I'll light you up, and drags you from your car, like lynching, except you were in custody, though not convinced of its lawfulness. You're going to arrest me for changing a lane. 2, leaving Chicago. Mamie Till knew quite a bit about lynching. After crowbarring open that coffin, saw the telltale ring, and, as she claimed, felt over every inch of what was left of little man's body, dredged up from Money, Mississippi. Black people get lynched over cigars, cigarettes, cigarillos, whistling, loud music, loud talk, back talk, praying, running, defective tail lights, toy guns, hoodies, and our own damn wallets. Don't be Black and leaving from Chicago and traveling south. You may not stand the storm if you're a sassy Black teenager whistling, or a fly Black girl smoking and unused to taking low to nonsense, even fatal nonsense. Better to stay with the extreme temperatures of your Midwest metropole than to cross the median in a Texas prairie town or a Mississippi Delta.
Wow. Was that from your By My Precise Haircut collection?
No, this is new.
Oh,
This is new. Uh, and I think it's yet unpublished.
wow.
Yes, as yet unpublished. Yeah. Hopefully it'll be in I'm working on a collection of new selected and revised poetry for Northwestern University Press. So I'm hoping that, some of these will be in there.
When is that expected to come out?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay.
I got to turn it in and get on their schedule.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that we are just that was great that we were able to certainly have you read that on the podcast. Very powerful and an interesting juxtaposition, because I think it reminds us again, as we've been speaking, of just the legacy of the fight we've been having to do being here in this country.
Right. I know. Really.
Poetry is so powerful. Poetry is so, it is this to me, this real distillation that if you take it someplace and a drop of it can just be explosive. So when I hear poetry like that, I just know that the more we can engage our hearing of it and writing it, the more we can help in this legacy of revolution and radical energy to transform the world in which we live.
Yeah.
And really, when I think about your work, I think about it that way, and just your real push for the precision. I mean, it really is that precision in words, so people can find their way home,
Mm-hmm. Good way to put it.
Well, thank you. This has been an amazing conversation for me.
It has.
I always
For me
ask,
too.
I ask Dr. Clark, I ask our guests one final question, and that is there something I left out, a question I didn't ask, or something that you think our listeners should know about you, your work, or just what you're thinking about in this world?
Oh, goodness. We have talked about a lot. And I think the most important thing we talked about was the role of women, and also where we have to go as LGBT seniors, the visibility. How old are you?
I'm 51.
And they let you be in this organization?
Well, Zami Nobla starts out at 40, because one of the things that we realize is that if you can get some younger women or midlife women into the flow and we mix intergenerationally, then we can really fortify that legacy. And so as we are, I don't want to say aging out, but as we are aging, the leadership that's coming behind us is very much aware of what's going on. So you are preparing people to take your place once you're gone. So I think that that's why that model for us is so important, because so often, and I don't want to say the Dorothy Height example, but we hold on to leadership when we should let it go.
No.
And so if you're not preparing younger women, younger Black lesbians behind you to take your place, then your place will not be filled when you're gone. And so I know, even as someone who's doing this podcast, there's going to be someone who's going to take over this. And so I'm actively looking for someone who can do that, who can keep doing what we're doing.
No, it's true. We have to attract younger people, not just so they can feel sorry for us getting old, but so they can lead.
Yes. Well, Dr. Cheryl Clark, thank you so much for being in conversation with me today and for being part of our Black lesbian herstory.
Thank you, Angela. It was my pleasure.
Sometimes you get these opportunities that are landmark. And this was just a wonderful, wonderful conversation with Dr. Cheryl Clark. What an amazing poet. What an incredible mind. What a fierce voice. So if you've not had a chance to read any of her work, then you better go pick up a book right now. Because yes, y'all, she is all of that. I so appreciated her reading that new poem for us. What a generous offering. May you listen to it again and it speak to your very core about the work that needs to be done in this world and our mobilization to go forward. If you've enjoyed the podcast, do me a favor, leave a comment, some feedback, share an episode with a friend. Just don't leave me hanging. Let me know you like it, so I'll keep doing it again, just like this. Until next time, my friends, have a sweet one.
Sweet.